My name is Lena Whitaker, and I was 36 years old the day a lawyer told me my parents had left me the worst piece of land in the family. My brother Grant got the penthouse in Chicago, 27th floor, glass walls, lake view. Private elevator, valued at $2.5 million, free and clear. I got a flooded farmhouse outside Miles Crossing, Montana, with a collapsed porch, black mold in the pantry, a barn roof folded like wet cardboard, and 6 inches of standing water in the kitchen after every hard rain. Grant laughed when the lawyer read it, not loudly, not like a villain in a movie. Just one sharp little breath through his nose, the kind of laugh people give when they think life has finally confirmed what they always believed about you. My mother's sister touched my arm and whispered, "At least it's land." My fiancé, Nolan, stared at the table like the embarrassment belonged to him, and my brother leaned back in his chair, smoothing the cuffs of a suit he could not afford without my father's money, and said, "Dad always did know which kid could handle which life." I did not answer. I did not cry. I took the thin folder the lawyer slid toward me, the one with the deed to a drowned farmhouse nobody wanted, and I drove home with it sitting on the passenger seat like a joke written in legal language. 3 days later, Nolan packed his things. He said he had been patient. He said he had waited for my life to stabilize. He said a woman my age is still be one disaster away from borrowing from family. Then he said the sentence that finally made taking off his ring feel easy. "Your parents left you exactly what they thought you were worth." I placed the ring on the windowsill. It made a tiny sound against the glass, a small click, a clean ending. The next morning, I drove 7 hours east to the flooded farmhouse with 2 suitcases, a thermos of burnt coffee, and a folder full of disappointment. I went because I had nowhere better to go. I went because the house was mine. I went because my father had once told me that land remembers who comes back for it. And what I found beneath the pantry floor was worth more than Grant's penthouse, more than Nolan's pride, and more than every apology my family would later try to offer me. But the money was not the real discovery. The real discovery was why my parents had hidden it there, and why my brother had needed me to believe the farmhouse was worthless before I ever stepped foot inside. The law office, where the inheritance was read, smelled like lemon polish and old carpet. It sat on the 2nd floor of a brick building in Helena, above a dentist and across from a coffee shop where people smiled through windows at lives that had not just been split open. My parents had died 4 months apart. My father first, after a stroke that came without warning while he was checking fence line near the old creek road. My mother followed in spring, quietly, in her sleep, as if grief had simply sat down beside her and waited until she stopped arguing. By the time the lawyer called, I had already done the practical grieving. I had chosen songs, ordered flowers, canceled utilities, sorted medicine bottles, answered relatives, written thank you cards. I had done what I always did in my family. I had managed. Grant had flown in for the funerals, cried beautifully, made one phone call to his office in Chicago from the church parking lot, and flown back out before the casseroles stopped arriving. Everyone said grief looked different on different people. That was true. On Grant, grief looked like a black cashmere coat and a return ticket. On me, grief looked like paperwork. The lawyer, Eleanor Pike, was a small woman with silver hair cut blunt at her jaw and eyes that had watched too many families discover what love looked like when converted into property. She placed 2 folders on the table, one thick, one thin. The thick one went to Grant, the thin one went to me. That was my first warning. She read calmly. To my son, Grant Michael Whitaker, I leave the Chicago residence located at 814 North Lake Shore Drive, Unit 2702, together with furnishings, parking rights, and all associated ownership interests. Grant's wife, Maribel, made a soft sound of relief. She tried to disguise it as sadness. She failed. Grant closed his eyes for a second, like a man receiving confirmation from heaven, then Eleanor turned the page. To my daughter, Lena Rose Whitaker, I leave the original Whitaker homestead outside Miles Crossing, including the farmhouse, outbuildings, acreage, appurtenant rights, and all records stored on the property. There was a pause, a real pause. The kind a room takes when everyone is trying not to look at the person who has just been publicly humiliated. The Whitaker homestead had been empty for 12 years. Everyone knew that after the last bad flood, my parents moved closer to town. They rented the farmland to neighbors, ignored the house, and let weather do what weather does when nobody stops it. The porch sagged, the basement filled, the county had sent notices. The roof needed replacing. The place had become a family punchline. Whenever someone was stubborn, my mother would say, "You're about as useful as the old farmhouse in rain season." Now I owned it. Grant glanced at me. I saw satisfaction before he remembered to look sympathetic. "Lena," he said, "I'm sure Mom and Dad had their reasons. That was how Grant hurt people. He wrapped cruelty in respect for the dead." Eleanor kept reading. There was no cash distribution, no investment account divided between us, no explanation, just the penthouse for Grant and the drowned farmhouse for me. Afterward, Maribel hugged me carefully, the way wealthy people hug bad news. My Aunt Carol told me my parents must have trusted my practical nature. Grant offered to connect me with a demolition contractor. "Honestly," he said, "the land might be easier to sell if the house is gone." Eleanor looked up at that, just slightly, a small movement, but I caught it. I had spent 15 years working as a records analyst for a county planning office. My job was mostly invisible. I read permits, drainage reports, floodplain maps, deeds, easements, and the buried history of places people wanted to change quickly for profit. I noticed small movements. I noticed when a lawyer heard something that mattered. So I asked, "Why does the will mention records stored on the property?" Grant rolled his eyes. "Probably Dad's old junk." Eleanor closed the file. "Your father was particular about wording. Meaning?" She looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. "Meaning I would not destroy anything until you have reviewed the property carefully." Grant laughed. "Come on, it's a wet shack." Eleanor did not smile. Sometimes wet shacks come with dry documents. I did not understand then. But Grant did, or at least he understood enough to stop laughing. That evening, Nolan made pasta in our apartment and spent the entire meal discussing realistic next steps. That was Nolan's phrase for surrender. Realistic next steps. Sell the land, take whatever I could get. Use the money to pay debt. Move on. Do not get sentimental. Do not chase ghosts. Do not become the kind of woman who thinks a ruined farmhouse is a sign from dead parents. I listened. Then I said, "I want to see it first." He put down his fork. "Why? Because it's mine." "That's not a reason. It is to me." He rubbed both hands over his face. "I cannot build a future around your feelings, Lena." I looked around the apartment we had rented together. The sofa I bought secondhand, the dishes my mother gave me, the plant he never watered. The life I had been trying to make feel permanent with someone who saw loyalty as inefficient. "I'm not asking you to," I said. That was when he told me what he really thought about the farmhouse, about my family, about me. He said I was too calm because I had no ambition. He said Grant knew how to turn inheritance into a future. He said I collected burdens the way other women collected jewelry. And finally, he said my parents had left me exactly what they thought I was worth. I remember the silence after, not because it was empty, because it was full of every time I had made myself smaller so someone else could feel reasonable. I took off the ring. I did not throw it. I did not make a speech. I set it on the windowsill. Nolan stared at it like he had expected tears and gotten a receipt. By sunrise, he was gone. By noon, I was driving east. The road to Miles Crossing was long, flat, and honest. Montana does not soften distance for you. It lets you see exactly how far you still have to go. The sky opened wide above fields washed pale by spring rain. Creeks ran high. Ditches flashed with standing water. Every mile closer to the homestead brought back something I had tried to forget. My father teaching me to read survey stakes before I could multiply fractions. My mother hanging sheets on the line behind the farmhouse, Grant throwing rocks into the irrigation ditch while I followed Dad with a clipboard too big for my hands. Back then, I thought the farm was ordinary because children think whatever surrounds them is the whole world. I did not know the difference between land and property yet. Property is what people fight over. Land is what remains after they are gone. The farmhouse appeared at the end of a gravel road bordered by cottonwoods. It looked worse than I expected. That annoyed me. I had prepared myself for bad. I had not prepared myself for defeated. The white paint had peeled into gray strips. The porch leaned left. The front steps had sunk into mud. Water stood across the yard in silver sheets, reflecting a sky too beautiful for the damage beneath it. A red-winged blackbird called from the fence line. Somewhere water moved where water should not have been moving. I parked near the barn and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. "This is what I'm worth," I whispered. Then I got out. The first hour was inspection. That is what saved me from emotion. Inspection gives grief a clipboard. I walked the perimeter. The south ditch was clogged. The culvert under the drive had been crushed. The old drainage channel behind the house had silted over, but not naturally. Someone had pushed fill into it, fresh enough to matter. The flood was real, but it had been encouraged. I stood beside the blocked channel and felt my attention sharpen. Water tells the truth. It follows grade, pressure, gravity, weakness. If water is where it should not be, something sent it there. Inside, the house smelled of mildew, mouse droppings, and old cedar. The kitchen floor buckled near the sink. The wallpaper had bubbled. A raccoon had left muddy prints across the pantry shelves. But the bones of the place were stronger than they looked. My father had built repairs into repairs, extra bracing, old oak beams, hand-cut thresholds. He had not treated this house like trash. Someone else had. I opened windows, found the breaker box chocked for rot, took photographs. Then I reached the pantry. The pantry door stuck halfway open, swollen from moisture. Behind it, shelves sagged under mason jars, rusted tins, and a flour bin that had not held flour in decades. The floorboards were warped except for one square near the back wall. That square was level, too level. I crouched, pressed my palm against the wood. It did not give. The surrounding boards groaned under my weight. That one did not. I ran my fingers along the seam and found 2 brass screws, painted over in the same shade as the floor. My father's work, careful, he deliberate. I went to the truck, got a screwdriver, and came back. The screws fought me, then released. The board lifted. Beneath it was not dirt. It was a metal box wrapped in oilcloth, dry as bone. I sat back on my heels. For a moment, I did nothing. There are seconds in life when you understand that before and after are about to separate. I pulled the box out. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were ledgers, folded maps, old water rights certificates, photographs, correspondence, and one envelope with my name written in my father's blocky hand. Lena, not Grant, not whoever finds this. My hands started shaking then. I opened the envelope last because I was afraid of wanting his voice too badly. First, I looked at the documents. The top certificate was dated 1896, Territorial Water Appropriation Record. Whitaker Ditch No. 1, my fidi date. May 17, 1896 use. Irrigation, stock water, domestic supply. Source, Cottonwood Creek and associated spring channel. I stopped breathing. In Montana, water rights are not casual things. They are not decorative. They are history with legal teeth. A senior water right from 1896 does not just mean you can water a lawn. It can control who in a valley gets water during shortage. It can make dry land valuable. It can stop a development. It can make a ruined farmhouse the key to everything around it. I went through the folder faster. There were more rights, some direct flow, some storage, some tied to springs I had forgotten existed. There were maps showing the old ditch system, the underground stone-lined channel behind the pantry, the wet meadow beyond the barn, and the place where the creek split before rejoining itself near the county road. There were letters from state agencies. There were notices from developers asking whether the family would sell. There were offers, 6 figures, then 7. Then one letter from a company called North Prairie Data Group offering an option agreement for water access, fiber corridor easements, and land assembly. I read the number twice, $8 million up front, more after approvals. The offer had been made 3 years earlier. My parents had never mentioned it. Then I opened my father's letter. My sweet Lena, if you are reading this, then you came to the house before letting anyone tear it down. That is why it is yours. I know what people will say we left you. They will say we left you rot, water, work, and shame. Let them say it. People who measure with their eyes are easy to fool. Your brother sees buildings. You see systems. Your mother and I did not give you the farmhouse because it was broken. We gave it to you because you know how to ask why something broke. The water under this land is older than our name. The rights attached to it are powerful enough to make people lie, flatter, threaten, and call greed by prettier names. Do not sign anything quickly. Do not trust Grant with the maps. Do not let anyone convince you that selling the water is the same thing as saving the farm. Water is not an inheritance, Lena. It is a responsibility. If you choose to keep it clean. If you choose to use it with conscience. If you choose to protect it, do it on paper. Paper is what outlives memory. I love you more than I ever knew how to say without sounding like a man afraid of his own heart, Dad. I read the letter sitting on the pantry floor while water dripped somewhere behind the wall. Then I read it again. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope because grief was rising in me and I needed my hands to do something precise. Do not trust Grant with the maps. That sentence changed the room. It meant my father had known. Not guessed, known. I thought of Grant at the lawyer's office, laughing too quickly. I thought of his suggestion to demolish the house. I thought of the blocked drainage channel outside. Then I pulled out my phone and checked the property records from the county database. My signal was weak, but enough. 3 months before my father's stroke, a preliminary site plan had been filed for something called Prairie Crown Development, luxury rural estates, private lake, events lodge access road, water amenities, applicant contact, Grant Whitaker Consulting, LLC. My brother had been planning a development around land he did not own yet, and for that development to work, he needed my water, or he needed me to believe the water had ruined me. I spent that night in the truck because the house was too damp to sleep in safely. Rain hit the windshield. The farmhouse sat in the dark like an accusation. I did not sleep much. At 2:00 a.m., my phone buzzed Grant. I watched his name glow in the dark, then I answered. Did you go out there? He asked. No, hello, no, how are you? Just fear dressed as authority. Yes, you shouldn't stay. Place is dangerous. I noticed. I can send a contractor Monday. We'll get a demolition estimate. I didn't ask for one. He sighed. The older brother sigh, the one meant to make me feel young and inconvenient. Lena, don't turn this into a thing. It is a thing. It's a flooded farmhouse. It's my flooded farmhouse. Silence, then his voice softened. Look, I know the will felt unfair. Did it? Come on, say it. He paused. Fine. Yes, it looked unfair. But maybe Mom and Dad knew you'd get sentimental and I'd make practical decisions. There it was again, practical. The word greedy people use when they want applause for wanting more. I looked toward the dark outline of the pantry window. Grant, I said, did you file plans for Prairie Crown? The line went dead quiet, not disconnected. Then he laughed too late. That was exploratory. On land you didn't own. Adjacent land, with water features. We were looking at possibilities. With whose water? His breathing changed. Be careful, Lena. The sentence was soft. That made it worse. Is that advice? It's concern. No, I said. Concern calls before the inheritance reading. I hung up the next morning. I took photographs of everything. The blocked ditch, the crushed culvert, the water line inside, the pantry box, every document. Then I drove to Miles Crossing and found the one person my father's letter told me to call in a note tucked behind the water certificates, Marin Holt Water Attorney. Bozeman, do not let Grant recommend counsel. I called from the parking lot of a gas station. Marin answered on the 4th ring. When I told her my name, she went quiet. Then she said, I wondered when you'd find the box. That was how I learned my father had not been alone. He had hired Marin 2 years before he died to audit every water right attached to the homestead. He had confirmed ownership, corrected old filing errors, defended the rights against abandonment claims, and prepared a conservation transfer packet he never signed. Your father wanted options, Marin said, but he wanted you to choose. Why me? Because your brother wanted liquidation before he understood the asset. I sat in my truck with my forehead against the steering wheel. Did Grant know about the water? He knew enough to be dangerous. Over the next week, the shape of the truth emerged. Grant had approached my parents about modernizing the homestead. He wanted to package the farmhouse acreage with neighboring parcels and sell to North Prairie Data Group, which had quietly shifted from luxury estates to a water-heavy server campus disguised as rural economic development. The company needed reliable water access, drainage modification, and road easements. My parents said no. Grant kept pushing. Then, after my father's health began declining, drainage problems at the farmhouse suddenly worsened. The culvert was cracked, the ditch filled, the basement flooded, county notices piled up. Insurance became complicated. Contractors declared the house impractical, and Grant began telling everyone the property was a liability, a burden, a wet shack. The same story repeated enough times becomes family truth. By the time the will was read, everyone was ready to believe I had lost. That had been the point. Marin told me not to confront him. Not yet, she said. A man who damages land for leverage will damage records if he thinks you're awake. So I did what calm women do when rage would be satisfying but useless. I made a file. I pulled county drainage permits. There were none. I pulled satellite imagery. The drainage channel was intact 18 months ago, blocked 6 months ago. I pulled contractor invoices from a lien search and found one paid by Grant Whitaker Consulting for earthwork access improvement along the county road. I found emails my father had printed and stored in the box. Grant asking him to stop clinging to obsolete water thinking. Grant telling him Lena will never understand the opportunity. Grant warning him that if the family did not move fast, outside parties would lose interest. My father had written one sentence in the margin. He thinks water is a product because he has never been thirsty. That sentence became my anchor. During those weeks, Nolan called twice. I did not answer. Then he texted. I heard about the land. Hope you're okay. I may have been harsh. I stared at the message. Harsh? A word people use when they want forgiveness without naming the blade. I deleted it. Grant moved faster. He sent a realtor to the farmhouse without permission, then a contractor, then an appraiser who claimed he had authorization from the family. I met the appraiser in the muddy driveway with my deed in hand. The family is not the owner, I said. I am. He left. 2 hours later, Grant called screaming. Not loud annoyance, real fear. You are going to ruin everything. What is everything? You don't understand what's at stake. Then explain it. You think a few old water papers make you smart? No, I said. I think they make me owner. He said nothing. Then very quietly, you have no idea who you're dealing with. That was the second threat. The first had been family. The second was money. Marin identified the money a week later. North Prairie Data Group was backed by a private infrastructure fund out of Denver. Their option agreement with Grant was conditional. He had promised access to water rights, drainage control, and a clear path to acquire the homestead after probate. In exchange, they had advanced him money, not millions, but enough to make him desperate. Enough to renovate his Chicago penthouse before he legally owned it. Enough to promise Maribel that their life was secure. Enough to make a man who had always believed he deserved more begin behaving like losing was theft. The penthouse was not a gift. It was collateral in his imagination. My farmhouse was the missing piece. And I had just refused to stay stupid. Marin arranged a meeting with the county water commissioner, a soil hydrologist, and an old ditch rider named Amos Reed, who had known my father since before I was born. We met at the farmhouse on a gray morning, with wind bending the grass flat. Amos wore a canvas coat and carried a notebook held together with duct tape. He walked the ditch line with me for 2 hours. He said very little. At the blocked drainage channel, he stopped, spat into the mud, then said, "That didn't happen by weather." The hydrologist confirmed it. The fill had been pushed in by machine. The water that damaged the farmhouse had been redirected, maybe not enough to prove criminal intent alone, but enough to show the property had been made to look worse. Marin photographed everything. The water commissioner reviewed the certificates and looked almost amused. "Do you understand what you own?" he asked. "I'm starting to. This is one of the oldest active private water rights in the basin, senior to nearly everything around it. How valuable." He looked toward the wet meadow. "To the right buyer?" Dangerous question. To me? He nodded slowly. To you? It means nobody builds anything water dependent in this corridor without dealing with you. That afternoon, Grant sent a formal letter through his attorney contesting the will. He claimed undue influence. He claimed my parents had not been competent. He claimed the homestead gift was a mistake because they could not have understood its hidden value. That was rich. A man who mocked my inheritance as worthless now argued it was too valuable for me to keep. Marin read the letter and smiled without humor. There it is. What? The turn. He has to admit value to take it from you. That became our strategy. Let Grant talk. Let North Prairie talk. Let everyone who had called the farmhouse worthless explain, in writing, why they suddenly needed it. A month later, a mediation was scheduled in Helena. Grant's lawyer demanded it. The infrastructure fund requested it. Marin agreed. But before the meeting, she filed 3 things: a notice of senior water right ownership, a petition to correct and preserve the historic ditch system, and an emergency request preventing unauthorized alteration of drainage on the homestead. She also prepared one more document, a conservation water covenant that would permanently tie a large portion of the senior rights to agricultural use, wetlands restoration, and community drought reserve. It would not destroy all economic value. That was the difference between my story and a martyrdom fantasy. My father had not asked me to throw my life away. He had asked me not to sell the water like it was furniture. The covenant allowed me to lease some water legally to neighboring ranchers in drought years. It allowed restoration grants. It allowed the farmhouse to be repaired. It blocked industrial extraction, server cooling, artificial lakes, and luxury development. It kept the water working where it belonged. Once recorded, Marin said, it will bind the land. Grant could win a lawsuit and still lose the thing he wants. Can he stop it? If he gets an injunction before we record. When can we record? She looked at me. When you sign. I took the pen, then I stopped, because signing away profit is easy in a story. It is harder at a real table when your car needs brakes and your credit card balance has teeth. I thought about the penthouse, the view Grant would have, the way Maribel had exhaled when Eleanor read his folder. I thought about Nolan saying my parents had left me what I was worth. I thought about what selling unrestricted water access might bring, 8 million, maybe more, enough to turn every insult into a before picture, enough to never worry about rent, enough to become the kind of person people suddenly call wise. Then I thought about my father's margin note. He thinks water is a product because he has never been thirsty. I signed. Marin recorded the covenant the next morning, 48 hours before mediation. I did not tell Grant. I let him come to the table thirsty. The mediation room was almost identical to the inheritance room. Long table, bad coffee. Windows sealed shut, men in suits trying to make greed sound procedural. Grant arrived with Maribel and 2 attorneys. He wore a navy suit and the expression he used when boarding first class. North Prairie sent 3 representatives. One of them, a man named Calder Voss, shook my hand like he was measuring how much pressure it would take to break it. Nolan was there too. That surprised me. He stood near Grant, holding a folder, pretending not to look at me. Marin leaned close. Why is your ex-fiancé here? I'm about to find out. Grant's lawyer began with sympathy. That is how you know someone has come to take something. He spoke about grief, confusion, family legacy, responsible asset management, economic opportunity, and the danger of letting emotional attachment interfere with rational planning. He said the farmhouse was not suitable for me. He said Grant had resources. He said my parents would have wanted the family to benefit collectively. He did not mention that Grant had laughed when I inherited it. Then Calder Voss slid a proposal across the table. North Prairie would purchase the water rights and necessary land interests for $12 million. Grant would receive half pending settlement. I would receive half. The farmhouse would be demolished. A commemorative plaque could be placed near the entrance road honoring my parents. I looked at the paper. A plaque? That was what men like Calder offered the dead after buying what they loved. Grant leaned forward. Lena, this is more money than either of us expected. Be smart. Is that what you were when you blocked the drainage? His face changed, just a flicker, but enough. Marin placed photographs on the table, the crushed culvert, the machine fill. The altered channel, then the invoice from Grant Whitaker Consulting. Grant's lawyer stiffened. That is not an admission of improper conduct. No, Marin said. It is an invitation to explain. Calder-Voss looked at Grant. Grant looked at Nolan, and just like that, I understood why Nolan was there. I turned to him. You inspected the property for Grant. Nolan swallowed. I gave an informal opinion. Before or after you told me it was worthless? He looked away. That hurt less than I expected. Some betrayals arrive already expired. Marin opened another folder. Nolan Reeves submitted a contractor referral to Grant Whitaker Consulting 6 weeks before the will was read. I laughed once. Softly, the room looked at me. I could not help it. My fiancé had mocked me for inheriting a flooded farmhouse after helping my brother make it flood. Nolan leaned forward. Lena, it wasn't like that. It never is. Grant slapped the table. This is ridiculous. You're trying to make this emotional because you don't understand business. I opened my folder then, not quickly, not dramatically. I took out my father's letter, then the 1896 certificate, then the recorded covenant. I placed the first two in front of me, the last one in the center of the table. Grant barely glanced at it. Calder did. He read the recorder's stamp first, then the title, then the restrictions. His face emptied. Men like Calder do not panic loudly. They withdraw like snakes sensing fire. What is this? Grant demanded. Marin answered. A recorded conservation water covenant, preserving the senior Whitaker water rights for agricultural, domestic, wetland restoration, and drought reserve uses. It prohibits industrial transfer, large-scale commercial cooling, artificial recreational impoundments, and development uses inconsistent with the historic basin. Calder pushed the paper away slowly. So, when was this recorded? 2 days ago, Marin said. Grant stared at me. You signed away $12 million? No, I said. I signed away your plan. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I turned to Calder. Your project needed unrestricted senior water access. You don't have it. He gathered his papers. This changes our position. Grant looked at him. What does that mean? It means North Prairie has no current interest in a restricted asset. Grant stood. You can't just leave. Calder looked at him with professional pity. We can, actually, and they did. All three representatives walked out with their leather folders, their quiet shoes, and every future Grant had already spent in his head. The room they left behind felt smaller. Grant turned on me. You stupid, bitter little, Marin said. Finish that sentence carefully. He was breathing hard. Marable whispered his name. Nolan stared at the table. Grant pointed at the covenant. That was family money. No, I said. That was family water. You had no right. I had the deed. I'll fight it. You can fight for land you cannot use the way you wanted. You can fight for a farmhouse you called worthless. You can fight for water you can't sell to North Prairie. But you cannot unrecord what has already been recorded just because you arrived late. His lawyer was reading the document now. Really reading it, the way lawyers read when the case they came to argue has changed shape under their hands. Grant noticed. What? He snapped. His lawyer did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. Marin slid one final page forward. This is the petition regarding unauthorized drainage alteration. We will be asking the county to investigate whether work connected to your company contributed to flood damage on Ms. Whitaker's property. Grant sat down hard. For the first time in my life, I saw my brother without performance. Not confident, not chosen, not golden, just scared. And because I am human, part of me felt something twist. He was still my brother. He had still once pulled me out of the creek when I slipped at 8. He had still taught me how to skip stones before he learned how to throw them at people. But memory is not a pardon. I gathered my papers. Nolan stood as I did. Lena, he said, can we talk? I looked at him, really looked. At the man who had measured me by inheritance, left me in humiliation, then stood beside my brother for a consulting fee. No, I said. I made a mistake. You made an estimate. You were wrong. His face flushed. I loved you. No, I said gently. You loved a version of me that made you feel practical. Then I left. In the hallway, my hands finally started shaking. Marin stood beside me until they stopped. You did well, she said. I don't feel victorious. That's normal. What does victory feel like at first? Usually nausea. I laughed, then cried, then laughed again, because grief and relief often use the same door. The fallout came in stages. North Prairie withdrew its offer within a week. Grant's challenge to the will did not disappear immediately, but it lost oxygen. His lawyers tried to argue I had acted recklessly by restricting value. Marin answered with my father's letter, his prior legal work, the corrected water filings, and documentation my parents intended the homestead to go to the child most likely to preserve its historic rights. Eleanor Pike provided a sworn statement that my parents had been competent, specific, and painfully clear. They understood exactly what they were doing, she wrote. They anticipated conflict from Grant Whitaker and wished to avoid private pressure on Lena Whitaker by making the gift absolute. That sentence did more for me than I expected. My parents had not accidentally abandoned me to a flooded house. They had placed trust in me so completely that they knew I might hate them for it before I understood it. I did hate them a little for a while. Love does not cancel anger. I hated that they had not told me. I hated that they had let me sit in that law office looking discarded. I hated that my father's letter had to replace his voice, but eventually, slowly, I understood. If they had explained everything before the documents transferred, Grant would have fought before I had standing. North Prairie would have moved faster. Nolan might have played concerned fiancé and steered me towards selling. My parents had done something painful because they thought clean ownership would protect me. They were right. That did not make it painless. Grant's Chicago penthouse became a problem almost immediately. He had borrowed against expectations. He had signed consulting agreements tied to a development that would never happen. He had promised Marable stability with money that existed only if I stayed obedient. The penthouse was beautiful. It was also expensive to maintain when the fantasy around it collapsed. 6 months later, it was listed for sale. Marable sent me one message. I do not know what Grant told you I knew, but I am sorry for the way I looked relieved that day. I read it 3 times. Then I replied, thank you for saying that. Nothing more. Some apologies are doors, some are windows, some are just acknowledgments left on the porch. I did not need to walk through everyone. Nolan tried longer, voicemails, baromelms, a letter mailed to the farmhouse. He wrote that he had been under pressure. He wrote that Grant had made the project sound harmless. He wrote that he did not understand the water rights. He wrote that seeing me in mediation reminded him of the woman he fell in love with. That line bothered me most because I had been that woman the entire time. He only admired her once a document made her powerful. I burned the letter in a coffee can behind the farmhouse and watched the smoke drift toward the wet meadow. It felt less dramatic than I expected. Most endings do. The real work was not revenge. It was repair. The farmhouse needed everything: roof, flouring, drainage, electrical, plumbing, mold remediation, fascia support, a new culvert, a legal ditch restoration plan. I used grant funding tied to wetland restoration, a small loan, and the first legal lease payment from neighboring ranchers who needed drought support under the covenant terms. Not millions, not penthouse money. Enough. Enough is an underrated word. The first winter back in the farmhouse, I slept in the only finished room with plastic over 3 windows and a space heater humming like a tired bee. The kitchen was still half gutted. The barn still leaned. The porch was gone entirely because safe demolition is not failure. It is honesty. But the water moved correctly again. That mattered. The old drainage channel carried runoff away from the house. The wet meadow held what it was supposed to hold. Cottonwood Creek ran clear. In spring, birds returned so loudly they woke me before dawn. I stood in the yard with coffee in both hands and watched red-winged blackbirds flash over grass my brother had wanted buried under luxury roads. For the first time in years, I felt my life expand beyond survival. Marin helped me create the Whitaker Water Trust, not a grand foundation, nothing glamorous, a small legal structure to manage leases, restoration, community drought response, and educational access for local students learning about water law and land stewardship. I kept my county job part-time at first. Then I started consulting for families who did not understand the rights attached to their land. People brought me boxes from closets, old deeds, ditch records, handwritten maps, letters from grandfathers, receipts from long-dead irrigation companies. I learned that half the rural West is held together by paper people almost threw away. My father had known that. Paper outlives memory. I framed his letter, eventually, not the whole thing, just one line: water is not an inheritance. It is a responsibility. I hung it in the restored pantry above the square of floor where the metal box had been hidden, not as decoration, as instruction. 1 year after the inheritance reading, Eleanor Pike invited me back to her office. I almost did not go. That room lived in my body, the lemon polish, the carpet, the thin folder. But I went. She had found a sealed addendum my mother had left with her personal papers, to be delivered only after the homestead transfer was secure. My hands shook when Eleanor gave it to me. Inside was my mother's handwriting. "Lena, your father wanted to explain everything. I told him not to. Not because you did not deserve truth, but because your brother has always been able to turn truth into argument before action can protect it. You were always the child who needed reasons. Grant was always the child who needed outcomes. This time, we needed the outcome first. I am sorry for the hurt this caused. A mother should not have to make one child feel abandoned to protect what belongs to them, and yet that is what I allowed. I hope one day the land tells you what we could not. I hope you forgive us slowly, if slowly is all you can do, Mom." I sat in Eleanor's office and cried harder than I had at either funeral, not because the letter fixed it, because it admitted the wound existed. That is all some of us ever wanted, not perfection, not repayment. Just one honest sentence that says, "Yes, that hurt you." I drove home with the letter on the seat beside me, the way I had once driven with the deed. The same road, different woman. At sunset, I walked the ditch line. The water moved beside me, clear and cold, carrying snowmelt through grass. I thought of my father, my mother, Grant Nolan, all the people who had mistaken quiet for weakness and usefulness for worth. Then I thought of myself in that law office, holding the thin folder while everyone silently assigned me the smaller life. They were wrong. Not because the farmhouse was secretly valuable. That is the tempting lesson, but it is not the true one. They were wrong because my worth had never been inside the folder. Not the thin one, not the thick one, not the deed, not the water certificate, not the covenant. The documents only revealed what character did under pressure. Grant was handed glass walls above Chicago and still wanted what ran under my mud. Nolan saw rot and decided I was rot. My parents saw water and trusted me to ask where it came from. And I saw a flooded farmhouse and came back anyway. That was the beginning of everything. People sometimes ask whether I would have made the same choice if the covenant had not been recorded before North Prairie increased the offer. If they had offered 20 million, 30, enough to make every practical person in my life call me foolish. I do not know. I would like to say yes with heroic certainty. But honesty matters more than performance. Money that large makes saints sweat. What I know is this. I signed before the bigger temptation arrived. Sometimes wisdom is not being morally stronger than everyone else. Sometimes wisdom is arranging your life so the worst version of you does not get a vote when the pressure comes. My father understood that. Marin understood that. Now I do too. Grant and I do not speak often. The lawsuit ended in a settlement that left my ownership intact, the covenant untouched, and Grant responsible for costs tied to the unauthorized drainage work. He never admitted malice. He admitted poor judgment. That phrase did a lot of work. At the final meeting, he looked exhausted, older, less golden. Before leaving, he said, "I didn't think you'd actually keep that place." I said, "I know." He waited, maybe for comfort, maybe for the old Lena who translated harsh truth into something easier to swallow. I did not help him. He nodded once and left. I do not hate him. Hatred takes maintenance. I have ditches to maintain now. That is healthier work. The farmhouse is no longer flooded. It is still not fancy. The floors slope slightly. The pantry door sticks when the weather changes. The porch I rebuilt is smaller than the original because I learned not everything has to be restored exactly to be honored. Some evenings, neighbors stop by with eggs, repair advice, or gossip. Kids from the high school come out twice a year to learn how water rights work. They stand around the ditch in hoodies, bored at first, then curious when I explain that the oldest piece of paper in a drawer can decide what happens to an entire valley. I tell them to read everything. I tell them not to ignore footnotes. I tell them land is never just dirt. I tell them water always remembers the path it was given and the path it was denied. They think I am talking about rivers. Mostly I am. On the second anniversary of my parents' deaths, I placed both letters in a cedar box and returned them to the pantry, not under the floor this time, on a shelf reachable. The secrets had done their work. They did not need to stay buried. Then I sat on the porch until the sky went purple over the fields. The farmhouse lights glowed behind me. The ditch moved softly in the dark. For a long time, I heard nothing but water. If you are listening to this because someone in your life handed you the thin folder, the ugly option, the burden nobody else wanted, I hope you remember this. Do not let their first reading become your final truth. Look closer. Ask why, open the box, ride the old papers, follow the water. Sometimes people give you less because they think less is what you deserve. But sometimes life hands you something broken because you are the only one who knows how to find the system underneath it. My parents left me a flooded farmhouse in Montana. My brother got a $2.5 million penthouse in Chicago. For a while, everyone thought that told the whole story. Then I found the water rights. Then I found the letter. Then I found out who had been trying to drown the house before I ever inherited it. And in the end, the penthouse became just another expensive room in someone else's downfall. But the farmhouse still stands. The creek still runs. The water is clean. And my name, the one my brother thought belonged at the bottom of the family ledger, is now written on the covenant that keeps that valley alive. That is not revenge exactly. It is better. It is proof. Quiet. Recorded permanent proof. The kind nobody can laugh away at a lawyer's table. The kind that outlives everyone who thought you were easy to measure.